The colossal, multi-hundred-million-dollar core system stood inert, its surface screaming with pulsing red warning lights. Inside the control center, 20 senior engineers frantically argued. Victoria Vance, the CEO, swept in, her impatience visible. Alex Miller, the low-level maintenance tech, watched silently. She shot him a dismissive, cold smile. "If you're so smart, Miller, fix it," she commanded. Engineers snickered. The downtime counter ticked relentlessly toward ruin. Alex walked toward the console, his steps measured. He stated, "Give me 1 minute." The entire room froze instantly into a terrifying silence. Alex Miller was officially classified as a day-shift operations technician, a title that implied more cleaning than coding. He was the invisible, foundational force that kept the complex machinery running smoothly, a role typically dismissed by the elite engineering corps as mere technical labor. His daily tasks involved physical checks, critical component calibration, micro adjustments to alignment, and the relentless, non-glamorous pursuit of preventative maintenance that the design teams considered beneath them. He was a guardian of physical reality in a world obsessed with digital metrics. His expertise lay in anticipating failure, not reacting to it. He spent his mornings scanning the faint electromagnetic signatures of the massive cooling pumps, using equipment the senior team considered archaic, vibration analysis tools and ultrasonic detectors that measured microscopic structural fatigue. The engineers focused on the software state. Alex focused on the material reality, ensuring the tolerances of the core rotors were held to the micron, a detail the latest automated diagnostic package frequently dismissed as redundant noise. He knew that digital redundancy meant nothing if the physical hardware ripped itself apart. In all team meetings, Alex was notoriously quiet. He chose to observe, preferring to listen to the resonant frequencies of the machines than the political debates of the executives. He kept his opinions carefully guarded, even when he recognized the senior team was chasing phantom errors reported by the software layers. He had learned that silence was the safest, most potent form of defense in a highly politicized, status-obsessed environment. This calculated obscurity was a choice rooted deeply in his past. 5 years ago, Alex hadn't been on the floor wearing a simple oil-stained uniform. He had been Dr. Alex Miller, the chief system architect for this exact project, a foundational visionary who laid the groundwork for the core operating platform. He was the highest-paid engineer in the firm, a position that came with immense prestige but brutal political pressure. He had walked away from that highest rank and a massive 7-figure salary after lodging a formal, ethical objection. The board, prioritizing a brutal, non-negotiable launch schedule, decided to approve a budget cut that stripped away critical, non-mandatory system testing, specifically the resilience test for thermal runaway under sustained high-stress mixed load. Alex had argued fiercely that this compromise guaranteed future, catastrophic instability. When his ethical boundaries were crossed, he chose his integrity and the peace of a quiet life to raise his daughter, Lily, over the power and wealth of the C-suite. He accepted the lowest technical rung available just to stay close to the machinery he understood so intimately. He remained close enough to listen to the truth of the system, but far enough to avoid the internal politics and the corrosive pressure to compromise. His new life was defined by the non-negotiable details of Lily's routine: packing her lunch, extra grapes, a note tucked into her sandwich, and ensuring he was home by 6. His routine included mandatory video calls at lunch to hear about Lily's latest school projects, a ritual that tethered him firmly to a reality far more important than server uptime or quarterly results. The rhythmic stability of his personal life sharply contrasted with the chaotic, high-stakes environment he now moved through as an anonymous technician. Enter Victoria Vance. She was the CEO, a leader defined by her aggressive focus on velocity, invisible, quarter-over-quarter results. She believed deeply in consensus and authority, relying implicitly on the sheer number of highly paid experts around her. Her managerial style used public, intense pressure to squeeze every last drop of performance from the engineering team. To Victoria, the process was secondary to the metric. If 20 people agreed on a solution, it must be correct. And today, her faith in numbers and consensus had failed utterly. The system was locked down by a critical, complex fault, a ghost in the synchronization array. This specific error only manifested when the platform hit a rare, high-stress mixed load, the exact condition Alex had warned about, a condition deemed statistically impossible during the compromised final testing phase. The 20 senior engineers, a team twice the size of the typical response unit and earning 30 times Alex's salary, had executed every playbook, every documented fix, and every known bypass. They failed collectively and repeatedly. As a low-level tech, Alex was automatically excluded from the high-level decision-making loop. He was simply viewed as someone who checked gauges and replaced filters, someone who couldn't possibly possess the theoretical knowledge required to solve this crisis. They were staring at complex code on their multi-monitor arrays. He looked like a man who checked oil levels with his bare hands. But Alex had a secret, non-digital advantage, a signature approach that set him apart. He didn't trust the screens. He understood that data logs could be manipulated, corrupted, or simply fail to capture the physical reality of the machine. He always observed the faint rhythmic patterns of the warning lights and listened to the machine's specific subtle hum before he ever opened the digital log files. He was a master of the machine's silent language. The engineering corps, blinded by data streams and theoretical models, did not suspect that the low-level technician in the standard uniform was the only person in the room who truly grasped the entire core architecture. The original, uncompromised blueprint that still resided somewhere in the machine's subconscious memory. To them, he was and would always remain an outsider. The facility now reeked of collective, visceral anxiety. The air, usually sterile and cold, was thick with the acrid scent of ozone and the psychological heat of 20 minds spiraling into defeat. The main control interface was a nightmarish scroll of conflicting data. Error messages scrolled endlessly, each warning fiercely contradicting the last. The primary diagnostic screamed, "Module D comms failure," demanding an immediate network patch, while the secondary safety console insisted on critical power fluctuation in segment H, mandating a total power down. No one knew which input to trust. The air conditioning, unable to cope with the heat generated by the failed operational cycles, and the sheer number of frantic human bodies, struggled audibly. Sweat beaded on the engineers' foreheads, mixing with the palpable tension. They were relying entirely on the visual data streams, each engineer furiously cross-referencing log entries from different systems, effectively creating 20 different, conflicting versions of reality. This reliance on the secondary data, which was actively being corrupted by the primary failure, only intensified the systemic paranoia. The screens flickered with a green-on-black text storm, an overwhelming torrent of information that had ceased being diagnostic and had become purely destructive noise. Every attempt to reset the system had resulted in a devastatingly predictable failure. The process was ritualistic. The system would fire up, climb smoothly to operational speed, and then, after exactly 180 seconds, the precise period of thermal saturation, it would crash violently, locking itself down again with a sickening cascade of flashing red. The cycle had been repeated 4 times, each attempt only deepening the despair and increasing the risk of permanent hardware damage. The CEO, watching the financial loss counter surge past the acceptable downtime threshold into the millions, slammed her fist onto the metallic conference table. "We must bypass the saw-fail. I need this system running now, at all costs." Her voice was raw with desperation, the veneer of controlled confidence finally cracking. David Chen, the lead systems integration engineer, proposed a desperate high-risk maneuver. "We need a forced hard power cycle on the main synchronization array. It's undocumented and outside the protocol, but it's the only way to clear the memory conflict that persists through the soft reboots. The risk of permanent hardware failure is high, potentially catastrophic, but we have absolutely no other option left." The proposal instantly split the group, creating a loud, frantic argument that drowned out the hum of the cooling units. Voices overlapped, each engineer fiercely defending their analysis based on unreliable data. David Chen, the lead engineer, was battling his own debilitating self-doubt. He knew the hard reset was a desperation move, a political sacrifice disguised as a technical solution. But the fear of doing nothing, the fear of reporting to the CEO that they were truly, utterly stuck, was a stronger paralysis. He glanced repeatedly at the clock, his hands shaking slightly as he moved to prepare the access keys for the procedure. The pressure was a physical weight on his chest, forcing him toward a choice he knew was fundamentally wrong but professionally expedient. The collective failure was crushing him into compliance. They were desperate, and the psychological pressure of the ticking loss counter had fatally corrupted their collective judgment. The system had won by forcing them into chaos. Ignoring the high-decibel arguments, Alex moved slowly to the cold metal housing of the main console cabinet. He wasn't focused on the screen data. He was listening. He pressed his ear against the casing, tuning out the noise of the room. He detected a subtle, persistent tock-tock-tock, a micro-frequency pulse that was precisely out of phase with the main operating rhythm. It was a tiny rhythmic anomaly that the advanced software logs, programmed to filter out environmental noise, had deliberately suppressed. He realized this was the machine's true cry, a self-imposed lock. Every time the 180-second thermal saturation point was reached, the system generated a critical integrity check on the thermal bypass layer, a check that had been removed from the current operational documentation. The machine was asking a question that the current system was programmed to ignore. Alex straightened up, his quiet voice cutting through the rising volume of the argument. The failure is not network, it is not power. It is caused by a critical cycle synchronization lock. The system is looking for an obsolete handshake signal. I need to isolate segment 7A, the thermal bypass layer, and manually flip the auxiliary safety state. He immediately faced institutional denial, loud and aggressive. "Miller, that's completely insane," David snapped, his face flushed with panic and anger. "That thermal module is passive. It waits for the host command, and your procedure is not in the current operational documentation. You cannot make unauthorized changes to the live system. That violates all 50 points of our safety standard." The other engineers voiced loud, angry agreement. Their collective fear of violating established protocol was now a greater paralyzing force than their fear of financial failure. Alex's simple, undocumented solution was a threat to their entire professional identity. Victoria Vance looked at Alex, the low-level tech, her gaze hardening into ice. Her patience was utterly exhausted. She pointed at the escalating loss counter, which had just ticked past the critical $50 million mark. She repeated her challenge, this time with final, unforgiving authority, ensuring every engineer heard her dismissal. "I told you, Miller, if you're so smart, fix it. But I will not approve a random procedure that violates every safety standard we uphold. Step aside. David, proceed with the hard reset." The air thickened to a choking consistency. The argument was officially over. The team was now ready to proceed with David's destructive, high-risk solution, a desperate gamble that Alex knew would destroy the hardware and bury the root cause forever. The collective mistake was only minutes away from becoming a multi-billion-dollar catastrophe, a terrifying silence pregnant with inevitable disaster. The moment Victoria gave the final, strained order for the destructive hard reset, Alex took action. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply placed a calm, heavy hand directly onto the console panel, physically blocking David's access. "Wait," Alex said, his gaze fixed on Victoria, and then on the chairman's screen. "That reset will fail and destroy the primary processor, forcing a permanent shutdown. It will not clear the conflict. It will simply create a more expensive, permanent problem." He held the room silent with a sheer, undeniable authority in his voice, and then delivered his first devastating bomb. Twist 1. The competence reveal. "I know exactly why segment 7A is out of sync," Alex stated, his voice dropping to a low, powerful register that commanded attention. "I know the precise signature of that obsolete handshake, because I was the lead architect who personally wrote and implemented the original synchronization module 5 years ago." A collective wave of absolute disbelieving shock ripped through the 20 senior engineers. Victoria's initial shock morphed instantly into a cold, terrifying awareness. She realized the staggering depth of her misjudgment. She hadn't just insulted a low-level worker, she had dismissed the foundational intelligence of her company. Her eyes darted to the HR files, searching for confirmation of the 5-year-old departure, finding the faint, long-forgotten paper trail of the ethical objection. The engineers, previously aggressive in their denial, began murmuring quietly, pulling up archived documents that faintly validated his claim. The room was no longer chaotic. It was reverently still, witnessing the sudden, total inversion of authority. Alex wasn't just smart, he was the source. The CEO, who prided herself on knowing her talent, looked utterly pale as she realized she had publicly insulted and dismissed the original creator of the very system she was desperate to save. Alex continued, his confidence absolute. The system you are running is currently executing a B-spec kernel, a compromised version. The original architecture had a multi-stage fail-safe check to ensure the auxiliary optimization layer was fully initialized before full deployment. A recent unverified optimization patch reset this check to its factory pre-launch default. The machine isn't broken. It's enforcing an obsolete pre-launch safety protocol, a ghost check, because the new documentation actively excluded it. He walked to a dedicated diagnostic terminal, bypassing the flashy graphic user interface entirely. He explained his requested fix. I need to inject code 4048, the one-time legacy command to temporarily disable the phantom safety wrapper. This will silence the obsolete integrity check and finally allow the primary core to execute the main operating thread. David, shocked but still clinging to protocol, immediately protested. But bypassing any safety layer is career suicide. You cannot guarantee that code 4048 won't trigger an even worse thermal runaway. Victoria, desperate, cornered, and seeing the cold surgical logic in Alex's clarity, intervened. The calculation was brutal. Trust the desperate gamble of the proven failure, or the cold certainty of the man who built it. She cut David off with a decisive chop of her hand. Do it, Miller. You have 1 minute, starting now. If this system fails completely, the responsibility for the total destruction is yours alone. Alex nodded once, accepting the ultimate risk. He worked purely on the small terminal, entering lines of code with blinding speed and a quiet fluency. It was less like typing commands and more like playing a complex musical instrument from muscle memory. His fingers didn't hover. They knew the precise sequence. He was a craftsman, intimate with his material. He executed the command. The room held its breath, suspended in a terrible silence. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The air crackled faintly with residual energy, and the red warning lights seemed to hold their furious glow, fighting against the incoming command. The CEO looked away, unable to bear the potential cost of her gamble. Then a low, powerful thrum resonated from the floor, the deep, harmonic sound of massive, perfectly calibrated gears engaging. The dense red lights on segment 7A blinked, flickered, and then changed slowly, almost reluctantly, to a solid, stable amber. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The error cascade reversed. The primary system roared to full life, the communication faults clearing in rapid succession. The entire platform stabilized, humming efficiently, accelerating smoothly back to 100% operational capacity. The 20 senior engineers stood motionless, stunned into complete, absolute silence. Their collective genius had failed spectacularly, and the low-level technician had saved them in less than 60 seconds. The humiliation was profound, but Alex was not done. The power shift was not complete. Twist 2. The truth reveal. Alex stepped back from the operational console and pulled up a secured, off-network document, projecting the original architecture log from his tenure onto the massive display screen, completely overriding the current system reports. The log clearly highlighted the exact safety synchronization feature that had caused the crash. Next to it was a comment, dated 5 years prior, explicitly warning, "This specific feature must be maintained and tested for 6 full weeks to prevent catastrophic cascading failure under mixed load." Below that, a subsequent document appeared, an executive change order approved by the former COO, explicitly removing the required 6 weeks of stress testing and documentation to meet the aggressive launch deadline. The reason was starkly clear. Total cost savings approved, $50 million launch deadline met. Axtawern. The system did not fail because of a technical anomaly, ma'am, Alex said, his voice quiet but echoing with undeniable truth. He was no longer a technician. He was a judge. It failed because of the decision to cut the safety net. It failed because a known critical vulnerability was actively left untested and undocumented for the sole sake of the timeline. The 20 engineers, finally facing the unvarnished truth, maintained their silence. The triumph of the revived machine was now overshadowed by the profound ethical and financial failure exposed by the man in the uniform. The room was heavy with the silence of exposure and corporate guilt. The steady rhythmic hum of the operational system was now a constant, almost mocking reminder of the failure rooted not in technology, but in corporate haste. Victoria Vance, her expression unreadable, but her eyes intensely focused, faced the multi-screen video conference where the tense board members watched the projected log files. She knew she had no choice but to confront the core truth. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steadying only through immense effort, "let's be clear. This was not a technical oversight that occurred today. This was a crisis caused by a systemic failure of due diligence, rooted in a decision made 5 years ago to meet a financial target by compromising safety standards." One by one, the 20 senior engineers were called upon to verify the diagnosis. David, the most senior and previously most vocal dissenter, spoke with raw, professional respect. "Alex was absolutely correct. We were searching for symptoms within the flawed documentation. We were chasing a software bug when the root cause was a leadership decision to ignore fundamental safety architecture. We owe him the truth of that." Mr. Harrison, the board chairman, a stern man with 3 decades in regulatory affairs, immediately honed in on the corrosive corporate culture. "Ms. Vance," the chairman's voice boomed over the speakers, cutting through the air. "The documentation shows this vulnerability was known by the core architect, yet ignored by management to save a few weeks of testing. We have a clear pattern of prioritizing velocity over safety. This culture of hit the deadline at any cost must stop. What is your plan to enforce a permanent, non-negotiable check on this system?" Victoria felt the full weight of the company's history pressing down on her. She looked at Alex, who remained quietly positioned on the edge of the group, a silent pillar of integrity. She admitted, "The failure was a symptom of a culture I inherited, and one I regrettably allowed to persist through aggressive targets. We need a fundamental shift in values, not just in code. The system requires an internal custodian of integrity." Mr. Harrison, the chairman, pressed the point, his voice heavy with finality. "Custodian of integrity. That is the perfect term. Ms. Vance, you spoke earlier of consensus. Here is the danger of consensus. When 20 voices all agree that a financial cost is too high, the singular voice advocating for safety is drowned out. That vulnerability was purchased for $50 million in savings, and it just cost us 3 times that in one day. We need a single point of technical conscience immune to financial and political pressure. Miller, what specific mechanism would ensure the system's truth can never be ignored again?" Alex finally spoke, addressing the entire room, the board, the CEO, and the 20 engineers, his philosophy cutting deep beneath the corporate jargon. He kept his tone low, focused, and completely devoid of bitterness or triumph. "The machine only speaks the truth. When we label complex, inconvenient data as noise, we are simply choosing to ignore the truth to avoid the cost of fixing it. The system did exactly what it was asked to do: protect itself from an impossible state by locking down. The failure was in the management of the data, not the machine." He paused, letting his words land with profound impact. Systems fail when people stop listening, to the outliers, to the faint alarms, and to the voices of integrity that are deemed inconvenient to the timeline. My job for 5 years was to listen to the machine's truth, even when no one else would. The silence that followed was complete, replacing the arrogant snickers and frantic arguments of the previous hour. No one laughed now. The entire meeting shifted from assigning blame to a profound, difficult session of corporate soul-searching. The board agreed that a new standard was necessary, They needed an internal firebreak, a final authority that transcended the immense pressure of financial deadlines. They agreed that Alex, the man who walked away from power to maintain his integrity, was the only choice to execute this new standard. They realized the biggest risk to the system was no longer a technical one, but a managerial one. With the crisis averted and the evidence of corporate negligence irrefutably documented, Victoria Vance summoned Alex to her executive office. The immense glass-walled office offered a commanding view of the newly stabilized facility humming below. "Alex," she said, rising to offer him a formal handshake, her gaze direct and professional. "You are the foundation of this system. I need that authority back at the top. Chief Architect, Chief Technical Officer, whatever title you want. Name your salary. You are the only person who can ensure this never happens again." Alex stood facing the vast window, looking down at the world of steel and logic he had just rescued. He remembered the peace of his life, the quiet routine with his daughter, and the specific ethical line he had refused to cross years ago. He politely and firmly refused the title. "Ma'am, titles and salary won't change the pressure to compromise," Alex explained, his voice even. "That pressure is systemic. It's built into the structure of the C-suite. But I will stay here, in operations." Victoria's surprise was genuine, quickly replaced by a fierce calculation. "Then what is your condition for remaining here? What authority do you require to ensure integrity at the lowest level?" Alex made his single, non-negotiable demand, a profound shift of power designed not for personal gain, but for systemic, long-term stability. "I request the authority to stop," Alex declared, defining his role as a check against managerial hubris. "If I, as the low-level operator walking the floor, detect a critical, root-level anomaly that falls outside standard protocols, a specific sound, an obsolete light pattern, a faint, out-of-phase thermal signature, I want the unconditional power to halt the entire system immediately. No managerial debate, no override, no waiting for a quorum. Just the power to enforce non-negotiable stability." It was a staggering request, giving unilateral veto power over a multi-billion-dollar production line to a floor technician. But Victoria had seen the cost of their impatience. She presented the demand to the board. Having witnessed the evidence of Alex's integrity and the cost of their own disregard, the board approved the request without dissent. Alex Miller, the low-level technician, was formally vested with the ultimate operational veto over the multi-billion-dollar platform. It was the cheapest, most effective insurance policy they could buy against themselves. His power was not derived from a title on a door, but from the simple, terrifying accountability he had accepted. He was now the ultimate regulator, his job title remaining operations technician, but his function elevated to systemic integrity guardian. The power he wielded was purely negative, the power to prevent, to enforce silence, to veto risk. The CEO's original mocking challenge, "If you're so smart, fix it," had been silenced forever. The arrogance that had led to the near disaster had been replaced by a necessary collective awe for true competence. Alex returned to his shift. He still wore the simple operational uniform. He still walked his routine perimeter, performing the mundane checks. He was still the single dad, the day shift operator. But now everything was different. Every time he walked past the control room, all 20 senior engineers, including a deeply humbled David, would pause their work. Every time Alex made a quiet adjustment or offered a suggestion based on the sound of the current, every manager and engineer immediately backed his decision without question. They had finally learned the most valuable lesson in high-stakes engineering. Listen to the quiet, unfiltered voice of integrity over the loud collective noise of compromise. The laugh that was meant to crush him had, in fact, given him the ultimate and most necessary authority. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to Single Dad Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.